for my later demos, I'm going to use, if you go into the student resources, sample models, I'm going to use this like flashlight folder if anyone wants to follow along. It's nothing like particularly interactive-y, it's just sort of like there if you guys want to reference it. I made a crappy flashlight model. It's great. Yeah, so that's pretty much that. In this case, I'm just going to grab my weird little self-character head, because I like my self-character head. And I'll show you guys how to set up a little turntable with this. And I guess sort of the expectations that I have for said turntable. So in this case, like I said, I'm going to start with just like a little platform. I'm going to make this one super ugly, and it's going to be really gross. So ideally, you know, maybe put some kind of like molding or something, or like, you know, at least a slight edge bevel so it's not just like a hideous cylinder. But for the purposes of this demo, you get a hideous cylinder. So I'm just going to make sure that my head is actually sitting on that and not clipping through it. If I wanted to be really picky, I could hold down D and V to snap my pivot to the bottom of this object, and then just hold down V and just snap that directly to the top of this little cylinder here. So as far as I'm concerned, again, if this was like, you know, if I made this to be smooth or something, I could smooth it and it would be like a perfectly respectable looking turntable. I also would like, you know, floors. Again, they don't need to be like incredibly fancy. I'm just going to make a plane and sort of rotate it around. If you wanted to be fancy and make this look even nicer, you could put this in part of a box and have, you know, give a little bit of bevel to that edge, but in this case I'm just being super lazy. Alright, so now that we have a turntable, like this is pretty much what I would expect from a turntable, where I can't see any of the Maya nonsense in the background. Why am I saving this? And then for lighting, for this I'd probably just throw in like a crappy little 3-point light setup or something. I'm not going to do anything crazy with that right now. I'm just going to go in and insert a random sky dome light because I can. And I have a sky dome or an HDR stashed in that flashlight folder, so I'm just going to grab that one because it's there. Flashlight, huzzah. Circus Arena, huzzah. So now when we render this, you know, we get this. Oh God, that's horrific looking. Please light your scenes better than this. This is a weird HDRI, but anywho, in terms of actually setting up the animations for this, whether you want to rotate your base with the object, I don't super care. In this case, I'm just going to go through. So I will start at frame 1, and again, this kind of goes into a little bit more keyframing. So I'm just going to start at frame 1 down here in my time slider. I am going to, presumably your object is only rotating around the X, so I'm going to right-click on Rotate X and do Key Selected. So you'll notice that it puts a little keyframe in the bottom of my screen. I'll expand this so you guys can actually see the time slider. Hello. So again, now we have a keyframe at frame 1. And you can see up here that only the rotate Y is keyed. You can also just go through and hit X. This is like a little bit the cleaner way to do it. This is more relevant for like actual like animations rather than just sort of setting up a turntable. And then personally, I like to go through and render. Ideally, you would render about 720 frames for this. So basically, for each degree of rotation on that this head is going to rotate, it's going to take 2 frames for that. Realistically, most people are probably just going to go to frame 360, keyframe it there, and then just render it out. So I'm just going to, so down here, I only have 200 frames in my scene, so I'm just going to go ahead and type in 360, and you can see it's added those frames in. So I'm just going to go all the way over, the frame's 360, and I will take this rotate Y, and I will set this. I'm just going to manually plug in 360 and right-click on the text again and do Key Selected. So you can see now as I scrub through here that my head is just sort of awkwardly rotating around, doing its fantastic rotating head thing. Yeah, that doesn't look questionable at all. Alright, so first of all, if you guys are ever, if you need to test the speed of anything, playing it through the viewport with the time slider is like not always time accurate. So like for one, this is going through 360 frames in literally 2 seconds, which is wildly unrealistic. If you guys ever need to change the playback speed down here, just right-click in your time slider, and you'll see there's a little drop-down for playback speed. Hopefully you guys can all see that, but there's a few options. Real-time, play every frame free, which is what it's set to now, which is pretty much play it as fast as you can render it, and since there's nothing complicated happening here, it's going really fast. And play every frame max real-time. So what that's going to do is say, play it as fast as you can until you hit real-time speed, in which case, stop. So I will usually use either real-time or play every frame max real-time. So if I play this now, you can see that it's going much, much slower than it was. And this is like kind of boring on the back of the head, but this is like actually a reasonable speed for a turntable, because it gives you, enough time to actually see what is happening as this object is spinning. Does this make sense so far? Any questions? Cool. All right, so the other thing that I asked for, two things I specifically asked for on the assignment. So the first one is make sure your object is rotating from a logical center pivot. In this case, that's not going to be easy to see. You can kind of see that the pivot is not quite centered in this, in the chest of the person. So she's kind of rotating around, kind of weird, spinning. It just looks a little weird, it's not quite centered, and it's kind of bizarre. It feels like she's sort of shifting around towards the different outer edges of this little circle here. So what I'm going to do for that is I'm literally just going to change the position of the pivot. So right now you can kind of see, you can see that it's centered pretty far forward on the figure. If I just take that, hold down D, I can just shift that back somewhere, maybe that's a little bit more centered. And now when I play this, it should be, you can see she's not sort of swinging out towards the side of the object so much, she's just sort of rotating more or less directly in place. But this is, what I would want to see for your turntable. Again, just make sure that your object isn't kind of swinging back and forth as it's rotating. Does that make sense? All right. The other thing that I mentioned as a specific requirement for the turntable, and I'm actually just going to go ahead and speed this up really quick, cough, because it'll be maybe a little bit easier to see. So I said I wanted the objects to rotate at a constant speed. So right now, if I let this loop, you'll notice that at the beginning and the end of the video, it's pretty much stops. It kind of speeds up in the middle, and then it slows, stops, and restarts. And then it speeds up, and it slows. Right, so it's a super easy fix for this. And it's going to make the whole turntable loop better and look a lot more polished. So all you need to do is open up your graph editor. So if you go to Windows, Animation Editors, and Graph Editor. So again, that's Windows, Animation Editors, Graph Editor. It's going to pull up this terrifying monstrosity, which isn't particularly terrifying right now, but all you need to do, so I'm just going to select my head, and you can see that it's actually showing me the keyframes for the object here. So this is basically a visual representation of the rate that this is turning. You don't really need to have a super deep understanding of the outliner right now. You'll get way more into this when you take animation classes. I'm not going to lie. So I hated this for a long time, and I was like, how the heck does this work? I have no idea. Graph Editor is actually your best friend. You should just take my word on it when you say you should get used to working with it, because it makes everything so much easier in the long run, even if it's kind of confusing to start with. Anywho, so in this case, I did mention a quick fix. Basically, I'm just gonna go through, just regular left click and drag. It's gonna highlight all of my keyframes for this object. And you just want to go up here, there's a little section of sort of differently shaped orange lines with little dots on them. You want to click on the one that's a straight line that says linear tangents if you mouse over it. And when I click that, you can see that it's straightened out that entire curve. So instead of having that sort of curve thing where it's slow, fast, slow, it's just constant speed. So if I play this now, you can see that when it loops, it doesn't do the crazy thing where it's speeding up really fast and then slowing down towards the end. It's just going pretty much at a perfectly constant speed. So again, that is something that I will be looking for on your final turntables. And may as well just set it up this week and have done with it. Because again, that is something I will be looking for very specifically on your stuff. Are there any questions about how to do that, or like any of the other requirements for this turntable? All right. Next bit in terms of turntables is actually rendering out the frames. Obviously, presumably, you don't want to go through and like manually render out 300 frames, because that's the worst thing ever. So you can set this up in your render settings. And this is, I'll show you, there's like a really nice little sort of hack you can do to just automatically render every 25th frame, which is going to save you a lot of time. Again, because you don't need to do it manually. So in this case, you can, if you want to rename your file, you can, or whatever it's going to name your image. I'm just going to leave it because I just don't really care right now. Image format, probably not a horrible idea to use something like a TIFF. TIFFs and EXRs are like the least lossy formats that you can do. JPEGs are disgusting, and please don't use JPEGs. If you're feeling lazy, use a PNG, or like pretty much anything except a JPEG or a MyIF file. Either way, I'm just gonna say PNG. I'll say TIFF for now because I can open those. If I'm doing TIFFs, I usually do float 32s, just because I find it's more data, so it's like better to post-process if you need to, and it's also just like, more color information. And the other thing you want to look at is, so if you go down here to frame and animation extension, what you choose here is going to open up some more options for setting your frame range. So basically you want to make sure, if you want to do like a batch render of multiple frames, you need to check one of the options that doesn't end in parentheses single frame. Because this is only going to render a single frame at once. It does not work for multiple frames. My personal preference is, this is basically just how it's going to automatically name and number your files. I personally like name _ number dot extension, because I don't know, I'm super paranoid that like if I have multiple dots in my file name, it's gonna like explode things. Just whatever you do, don't put one where the number comes after the extension. I don't even know why that's an option. So you'll notice that as soon as I click that, any option that's not single frame, it opens up this frame padding here and like these frame range attributes there. So for frame padding, it's basically just how many zeros do you want to add to the front of your numbers. Usually I'll just set this to like 3 or something. Again, for this, it's not going to be a huge issue for whatever you're doing. The actual important part that you are going to want to pay attention to for this assignment is the frame range. So start frame is the frame it's going to start rendering on, end frame is the frame that's going to stop rendering on. So in this case, I want to start at frame run, and I moved my keyframe, so I want to end this at frame 200. So pretty much just the length of whatever you want to render. And in this case, so by frame, this is saying if it's set to 1, it's going to render frame 1, 2, 3, 4, 5. If I set this to 25, it's going to render frames like 1, 26, 51. It's going to render every 25th frame, which is actually what your assignment is asking for. So I'm just going to go ahead and set this to 25. Cool. And then skip existing frames. If you've already rendered the frame, it's going to not re-render and overwrite that frame. Again, I don't really care if you check this. That's just like what that option is. And then for renderable camera, if you set up a new camera for your turntable, you'd go through and select that here, and change your image format, all that good stuff, pretty much like you've been doing previously. So are there any questions about the settings you need to render out a turntable? All right. Cool. So I'm going to really quick go through and set a project somewhere. So you should totally set your project before you render, or else it's going to dump your file somewhere really random. But in this case, I'm just going to go through and fully expecting this to be really ugly. if you want to render multiple frames at once, you're going to use what's called a batch render or a sequence render. So again, this is not in the modeling tabs. If I just click on this, I'm going to go to rendering. And you'll see that, again, I have more menus, and now I have this little drop down for render. So this is important. So I'm assuming that most of you are using Arnold and not Redshift. But there are two options here that will both work. Just depending on which one you choose, it will watermark your stuff, and I will take off points for watermarks. So if you are rendering with Arnold, you need to go down and use render sequence. If you do batch render, Arnold will watermark your stuff. So I'm just going to open the settings for this. Pretty much just gives you a few overrides, like if you want to override any of your render settings, which I mostly just ignore. So I'm just going to go ahead and click render sequence and close. And it's done it on the other screen because it's being annoying. But it's pretty much just going through, it pulls up the render view and it's just rendering each frame, sort of systematically going through. Very annoyed, let's pull this up on the other screen. Yeah, so if you, I can't actually show you guys. If I go into my images folder, you should see that it is just sort of dumping these little TIFF files in here. Yes. I don't know why I can open TIFF files but not PNGs, but excuse me. I can scroll through and you can see that it's pretty much just rendering, large chunks of my animation at once. So this is really all I'm looking for. Your stuff should be at full HD. It's faster to render this, so I just left it. Hey, here we go. But this is basically what I'm looking for this week's assignment, is just like nice, more polished, less horrifically grainy versions of whatever your turntable is. I would also expect, like, ideally your images would probably be a little bit closer to the head to show off your object better, but again, that's pretty much what I'm expecting. So are there any questions on that? Cool. And again, I go over pretty much all of this on like a legitimate little YouTube tutorial, so